Hi everybody, this is Dr. Anders. I'm your professor in Counseling 500, and I just wanted to make a few comments about the video blogs that you guys provided this week. This was actually the first time that the assignment was utilized, and I was unsure of what to expect from the video blogs and the presentations and the discussions, but I must say I was happily surprised and pleased with the results of the videos that you guys provided. They were very informative. You provided some interesting insight, and I was also able to collect a little bit of information from you guys because we tend to reveal a bit of our personalities as we talk. One of the things that I do with my clients when they come in is I automatically analyze their personalities based on their behavior, based on their speech pattern, how they breathe, the eye contact, the types of words that are used. So it's all of that information that a person contains that they reveal without ever knowing it. And that's part of what I was picking up on when you guys were presenting your information. And if you save this and you go back and you look at my presentation and a review of some of the things that I saw from you guys, then you'll also see some of my idiosyncrasies that I reveal. And they're easy to pick up once you learn to identify certain behaviors. So let me go through some of the things that I noticed about the videos, the comments that were made, all in regard to counseling, not in regard to you or your presentation. First of all, Paul, you mentioned the concern for unconditional positive regard. And that's a common element for all counselors. I think every counselor should possess that trait. And it's a trait that's a necessity for us to be able to make contact with a client. And what's amazing is that the clients automatically pick up on whether or not we perceive them without an attitude. And those that tend to have an attitude, clients will identify it and they'll either become uncomfortable within the counseling relationship or they'll drop that counselor and go to someone else, which is not uncommon if someone is uncomfortable in the counseling relationship. And I would expect you guys to do the same thing if you were in your counseling session and there were some elements about the counselor that you didn't like. It's not a requirement to stay with that counselor, but it is a requirement to have an understanding, to be respectful, and have a team relationship environment established. So to have unconditional positive regard is a necessity, as Paul identified, but it's to be able to convey it. And you convey it in a number of ways. You convey it by opening your hands. You convey it by leaning forward, by making eye contact. Also with your breathing, and I'll get into that in a little bit with some of the other comments that I'll have. But if we're excited and we're working with a client and we're remaining calm on the outside or with our speech pattern, but yet we're breathing rather quickly, well, a client's going to pick up on that conflict. And that's one of the things that I look for in a client, is that if they're talking to me and I notice a rapid pace of breathing, or I notice that the artery is starting to pulse a little bit faster than their speech pattern or their breathing, well, I know there's a conflict going on internally. So I'm going to look for that. So the unconditional positive regard is an important element. Tabitha, your image of a counselor is right on track, that counselors typically have a pad. I have a pad, and I use it continuously when I'm working with a client, and I'm writing down my notes. And there are elements of a session that I'm going to focus on. And I'm not going to try to write down everything that the client is conveying to me, mainly because I'm taping the session. I'll videotape all of my sessions because I'm the only one in the office, and I want to have some type of assurance that if there's any accusations made, well, then I can play back that videotape so that there are no questions. And if a client doesn't agree with it, then the client doesn't have to come in to talk with me. They can go to another counselor. But that's one of the requirements that I have in my counseling session, is that all of them are going to be videotaped. And I can go back and I can review that videotape, and the client can even review that session, but the client cannot have a copy of the session. So the image in the video, the image of the client sitting there and taking notes, well, that's quite common. And there are some counselors who will just sit there and listen, but I'm not one of those. I'm not writing down what the client is telling me. I'm writing down what my thoughts are in regard to what the client is saying, because that is the insightful messages that I'm receiving based on what the client is telling me. Now, the reason I write that down is because when I go back and I replay the tape, I may not have those insightful thoughts again. So I like to write them down, and I may have a question that I want to ask the client, so I'm going to write that down so I can refer to it a little bit later. Tabitha, you also mentioned something about open-ended questions, and I use 90% of the time in my session, I use open-ended questions. Now, the reason I use open-ended question is that I don't have to work as hard. So the client is the one that should be talking the most. I should be listening the most. If I find that I'm talking the most, then I'm not presenting the information correctly. So an open-ended question will require the client to respond with more than a yes or a no. It's going to require the client to go into detail. A closed-ended question is simply going to be a yes or a no, or a nod of the head. And that really doesn't tell me much. So my questions usually start with a how or a what. And I rarely use a why, because a why question typically places a client on the defense and provides a temporary impasse. So I avoid using, well, why did you do that? Instead, I'll use, for what reason did you do that? And the why is usually related and draws back memories from conflicts with parents or teachers or principals. Because most of the time growing up, we always hear, well, why did you do that? And why was that such an issue for you? Well, why automatically tends to link us to a defensive response. And adolescents typically shut down and they don't give as much information. So the best thing to do is just avoid using why altogether. Louise, let me see what. You were talking about the messages going beyond words, and messages are constantly being delivered to us from clients, and we have to look for those. For example, I automatically look for large muscle movement and small muscle movement when I'm asking a question. But for me to understand what those messages are, I actually have to analyze the normal behavior of my client. So if a client constantly taps the finger, well, that's not so much as nervousness or someone trying to hide something. It could simply be that that's their normal behavior. So if I ask a question that causes that finger to stop, well, now I know I've stumbled onto something that's important. So I'm actually looking for an anomaly to the normal behavior, but for me to identify that anomaly, I have to know what the normal behavior is. So for the first couple of sessions, I'm just going to carry on a casual conversation, set up the rapport, as you guys know, establish that unconditional positive regard, and then look for the normal behavior and the breathing patterns and the eye movement. And I want to find out if a client is recalling information from experience or if they're creating information. So I'm going to give them a question that's going to require them to recall. Typically, when someone recalls information, eyes will go to a certain location, usually in the upper left-hand side. If someone is recalling information, then the eyes are going to go up to the right-hand side. And that's just normal behavior, but it doesn't mean that it's the same for everyone. So what I do is I present information to find out what that client's behavior represents. Then, as we get into our sessions, I'll ask questions to see if there is a consistency. If there is not a consistency, then I know that I've stumbled onto something that probably should be investigated. And that's probably one of the elements of counseling that really takes a while for us to develop the skill for. It just doesn't come automatically, and the body language books are nice, but they're not accurate because we all behave differently. All right, the other thing that Louise, you mentioned is that our boundaries. Clients typically will test our boundaries, and I think they do it unknowingly. Clients, they will respond to who we are based on the information that we give them. And without them ever realizing it, what they'll do is they'll ask us questions or they'll respond to us based on the information that we're providing to them. And then they're going to pick up on some of our personal boundaries. And once we reveal those personal boundaries, clients typically will respond to that. And then they're going to find out just how far we will go with our personal information. So one of the elements that I practice in my practice is, that just sounded a little awkward, didn't it? But what I practice within my private practice is that I don't give a lot of private information. When somebody will ask me, well, how many children do you have? I'll say that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about your issues and your children. Or if they ask me about my relationship, I'll automatically take it back to them so that we can talk about their relationships. And I just don't reveal a whole lot. There are some counselors who will put family pictures and pictures of siblings and pictures of spouses, and that's fine, but I don't have any of that information in my office because I want it to remain private. Now, what I will do is I will reveal past information and how I can automatically connect to a situation that a client may be having. And if there's a loss of a parent, then I can convey that, oh yeah, I know what it's like to lose a parent early in life, and then I can talk a little bit about what my experience was with that loss. But I'm automatically going to bring the loss back to the client and have the client start telling me about his or her situation, and not so much on the feelings, but a lot about what they experienced. You know, the typical expression for counselors is, well, how do you feel about that? And I truly try to stay away from that, because even folks who are not professional counselors, who are training going into counseling, folks who are just lay persons in the counseling field who feel like they are good counselors, but they haven't gone through the training. That's the common wording that is used. And you see it a lot on video, on movies and television. And folks typically will say, well, how do you feel about that? So I avoid that on purpose. And I will usually ask something completely different and try to get the same information. So I eliminate the feelings. I may say, well, what are your perspectives about that? Or how did you react to that? Or for what reason was that so significant to you on that particular day? So there are a lot of ways to word it so that you're not asking that normal question of, well, how do you feel about that? Because I have found that clients most of the time will shut down when I start talking about their feelings, or they won't give me the accurate information that I'm looking for in regard to their feelings, because they anticipate that particular question. So, and if you think about your sessions with a counselor, and you automatically anticipated them asking you on how you felt about a certain scenario, you were prepared for that response. So what I try to do is get the response that a client is not prepared for. I want to provide that question, and I'm trying to address the response coming from the subconscious, which is typically the area where there's not a lot of thinking. There's not a lot of analytical response. So, Louise, you added some good information, and I liked the way you addressed it. Now, if you hear dogs in the background, I have 6 dogs, and sometimes they hear movement outside, so they'll go out and inspect it. So I apologize for any background noise. Eliza, you also talked about nonverbal cues and normal behavior within a therapy. And nonverbal cues are extremely important. And I mentioned this earlier, that nonverbal cues tend to tell me more than what I am looking for. And it tells me if there's a consistency within what the client is revealing. And clients will think about their answer and then they'll respond. But what I find a lot of times is that if I ask them a confirming question and ask them to validate what they just said, well, the subconscious is going to reveal one thing, but their physical action is going to reveal something else. So if somebody is talking about a car accident in which somebody was hurt in the other car, and they didn't feel like it was that big of an issue for them, I may ask them how the situation was addressed at a later date. Did they feel like the situation warranted additional contemplation on their part? And the response may be that, yes, I thought about it, or they may say, no, it really didn't mean that much to me. But you'll notice that my words are no, but my head is shaking yes. And that's the conflict that I'm looking for. I'm looking for that head to be in the opposite direction of what the words are conveying. So that nonverbal action is more accurate than the words are, because someone can refer something outwardly with their wording, but subconsciously the body is revealing a message completely different. So if I see this and I hear yes, and I see this and I hear a no, well, I'm going with the body action more than I am the verbal action, because it's typically the subconscious that's revealing that information. Now, the other thing that I'm looking for is I like to watch the breathing pattern of someone when they talk. As they become more and more involved in the conversation, watch the center of the chest and notice, without putting your eyes on the chest, I want to keep your eyes in my eyes, but I want you to practice watching where the chest and the breathing is. And as someone is talking, if you notice that breathing starts to get rapid, well, there's an excitability there, and that's usually going to reveal to you that there's something important about that particular area. Now, as you get back into a casual conversation talking about everyday stuff and the breathing goes back to normal, well, then you know that there's a change in the breathing pattern. And that's a nonverbal cue. The other element is the legs, so the shaking of the knee. And that's fun to look at, because as I'm making eye contact with my client, as I'm looking into this camera, I'm also looking at the perimeter of the person, and I'm watching every muscle that's taking place during our conversation, because I want to know what the normal behavior is. And if I ask a pertinent question that's going to get a response that's out of the norm, or that's going to create an anomaly, as I mentioned earlier, well, I want to make note of that. Or I may use silence as my tool. And if you haven't been watching the video and you've been listening, my silence caught your attention. So I like to use silence as a tool. And sometimes I will just sit there and wait for the client to respond to my silence. That is an area that a lot of counselors struggle with. If there is a pause within the counseling session, a counselor typically wants to fill that void with a question or a comment or an affirmation. But allow that silence to build. Use it. It's extremely effective, especially after you ask a question. And then keep your eyes on the client. Don't look away. Allow your eyes to penetrate the client's mind, because the client will start thinking about what you're trying to convey. And then you're getting a lot of information from the subconscious mind, which is where most of it is being stored. So silence is an extremely effective tool, but it allows you to pick up on some of those non-verbal messages that are constantly being revealed by clients. So utilize that. All right, let's see. Paul, you talked about the environment of the room and the chairs. And so a couple of you commented about how close the chairs were within the video. And I think that was probably done more so than the video than typically in an office. In my office, I won't be that close to a client. In fact, I'll be about 5 or 6 feet away. The client's in a recliner, and the client is going to be extremely comfortable. They can recline or they can sit up, but it's a huge recliner, and it's a leather chair that is very comfortable. And I'm about 5 or 6 feet away, and I'm in a rocker, and I'm sitting lower than the client. I want the client to be above me because I want the client to feel that they are in control of the session. I don't want the client to feel like I'm the one in control, because if the client is in control, if the client perceives he or she is in control, they're more apt to talk openly about whatever the topic is. But if they feel like I'm in control and I'm the one that's inquiring and questioning, well, then it's more of a defensive interaction. So I intentionally lower myself than the client, because the client tends to feel like they're more involved in that association than more so than me being placed on a pedestal. So the environment is extremely important. The other element about the environment are the messages that you are sending the client based on what you have in your office. Now, my practice is not a Christian counseling practice. It's secular, but I have a lot of Christians that come in to talk. And the secular clients know that I'm a Christian because within my office I have signs, I have pictures, I have paintings, a lot of things relating to my Christian belief, but I don't advertise it. However, when a client will ask me about it, then I've got the opportunity to now start talking about what my beliefs are. But it's not a relating factor to the counseling session. It's just how I set up the environment. I also have a professional office where there's not a whole lot of posters and funny saying and cute sayings, but I do have an environment. When someone comes in, they're coming in for a professional counseling service, and that's what I'm trying to convey to them. So when an adolescent comes in and that adolescent comes into my office, it's not the same as a school counseling office. It's going to be a professional environment so that adolescent is now going to start talking to me as if that person is seeking professional help, which is a bit different than what's in a school counseling environment. So the environment really does make a big difference. Nor do I have a desk in my office. I have a desk in another area where I do my work, but the environment in my regular office is nothing more than plants and chairs and tables that contain information, so that environment reveals more of a let's just have a casual conversation, and I can pick up on some information that you may not be ready to deliver to me, and I'm going to find out some of the things that you're thinking through some of the questions that I'm asking. And it's just through casual conversation and relaxing the client that I get the majority of my information. So the environment does play a big part in how I achieve that goal. Let's see. Ashley. What was Ashley? Your comment was that you noticed that the counselor was talking more than the client, and that's usually a revelation to the counselor that he or she is working too hard. The counselor really should not be talking as much as the client should be giving all the information, and that's the use of open-ended questions. If you find that you're doing a lot of talking, then you may want to step back, analyze how you're presenting the information and what you're trying to get from the client. So my sessions, by the end of the day, I'm not mentally exhausted. And the reason I'm not mentally exhausted is because I'm not doing a lot of the talking. I'm doing more note-taking and insightful messaging than I am talking to the client. So the client is the one who should be discovering all of this information as we go through our conversations. I should be proposing questions so that the client is making self-discovery. And that's the part of counseling that is rewarding, when a client looks at you and says, hey, could it be? And then when the client reveals what I'm thinking that I want the client to discover, well, then I know I've had a successful session. Now, all of that can be accomplished by using a variety of counseling theories and techniques. And that'll come a little bit later in some of your classes, and some of you may have already had counseling theory. And if you have, then you want to start picking up on different activities and different techniques that can obtain that information. Later on in the term, I'll be sending you a booklet that contains all the theories and techniques that I use within my practice. Well, maybe not all of them, but the ones that I use on a regular basis, and under which situations that I will use those techniques. And I typically go to those particular techniques because they've proven to be successful. And I'll give that to you a little bit later, so you guys will have that as a guideline, but not as a template to use in counseling. Just kind of look through it and become familiar on what I use with certain situations. So that wraps up pretty much some of the things that I was noticing through your video blogs. And I just want to reiterate that the work that you did with this assignment was very impressive, and I appreciate the time that you took in videotaping your sessions and discovering how to post it to the YouTube so that your classmates can view it. And I haven't done it, so after I finish this video, I'm going to be doing the same thing and finding out how I can post it to all of your files so that you guys can view what I'm saying. So I've enjoyed it, and I hope you guys get a little bit about what I've presented to you. And as we go through this term, if you have any other questions about counseling, don't hesitate to ask me. Also utilize your counseling advisor that all of you have been assigned to provide you with counseling information. You do have an advisor that's on the staff that's different than the faculty advisor. And that person is available to answer questions about counseling that you may have. And now would be a good time to ask those questions so that as you get into your other coursework, you can get information that will help you become a productive and an effective counselor, so that you can start helping clients become successful with solving and finding solutions to their issues. So God bless everybody, and thank you for participating and doing such a great job. Good night.